So September last year, Tony Blair, he dropped a pretty significant thought.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
He basically envisioned a 2050 world stage with like three main superpowers: U.S., China,
Hmm.
and India.
India, okay. And everyone else sort of
Right.
comparatively small.
Exactly. So, okay, let's unpack this a bit. For this deep dive, we've been digging through some recent analysis,
Hmm.
really trying to understand how India's economic engine, especially, its manufacturing, actually measures up against China.
Right, the big comparison point.
Yeah. We're looking at the sources you shared to see if Blair's prediction really holds water, given, well, the current economic situation and the challenges India is facing.
It's a fascinating prediction, isn't it? Ambitious. And the key is seeing if the data actually backs it up.
Right.
So our mission here really is to pull out the crucial insights, compare the manufacturing scenes in China and India,
Pinpoint the hurdles.
and the opportunities, yeah.
Yeah.
The pathways for India, and ultimately just offer, a well-informed perspective on whether that superpower status is, well, realistic.
We're trying to maybe uncover some surprising details, offer a fresh take on it all.
Exactly. Find a new angle.
Okay, so let's dive into the big picture first. How do the growth stories compare?
Well, historically, China had that incredibly rapid manufacturing-led boom,
Yeah.
very labor-intensive industries.
Right. Whereas India's manufacturing growth,
Yeah.
it's been more gradual and tended to focus on industries needing more capital investment.
That's a key difference. If you look around, say, 2010 to 2012, China's manufacturing was like 32.5% of its GDP. Huge.
And India.
Lower, around 17.5%.
Okay. And we saw something similar with jobs in industry too, right?
Yeah.
China was around 30%, India closer to 25%.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Capital intensity.
Ah, yeah. The sources mention this.
Even in high-tech manufacturing, China generally used less capital per worker, you could say, than India did, across most sectors, actually.
Less capital intensive. And there was analysis from, 2003 to 2007 showing this difference pretty clearly.
Exactly. And if you think about it, that lower capital intensity in China back then meant it could create more jobs for the same amount of investment compared to India.
So right from the start, India's manufacturing path was creating fewer jobs per unit of investments, a fundamental difference.
It put them on a divergent path from China's sort of labor-absorbing model.
Okay, now, bringing us more up to date, one source points to a bit of a slowdown in India's GDP growth.
The recent numbers?
Yeah, July to September quarter, it was 5.4%, which is, well, quite a bit lower than the Reserve Bank of India's forecast for early 2025. They were hoping for 7%.
That dip does raise a question, doesn't it? Is this growth story sustainable?
And that 5.4%, it looks even more maybe concerning when you put it next to other indicators that don't quite line up.
Like what?
Well, the sources point out this GDP growth hasn't really translated into, say, strong job creation or a big jump in private consumption.
Consumer spending, which is huge for India's GDP.
Right. And food inflation, slow wage growth, that's hitting how much people can actually spend.
Okay, so domestic demand issues. What about externally? Exports.
Yeah, that's another point.
Yep.
India's goods exports, usually a big growth driver, have basically stalled.
Sold out.
Valued at $1.1 trillion for the 2 years up to August 2024, which is the same as the 2 years before that. Flatlined.
That's not great. Lack of export growth raises concerns about competitiveness, doesn't it? And how well they're plugging into global trade.
Totally. A real contrast with China's historical export strength. And the sources also remind us, despite the GDP growth we have seen, India has still been a lower middle income country since 2007.
Right. Per capita income around, what, $2,400 in early 2025?
Yeah. And the World Bank estimates it could take another, 75 years just to reach a quarter of the U.S. average income.
Wow, 75 years. That really puts the whole superpower talk into perspective, doesn't it?
It does. It highlights that difference between the overall size of an economy and, well, the average wealth of its people.
Exactly. Superpower status isn't just about a big GDP number. It implies a certain level of economic well-being for, the majority.
And speaking of well-being, there's the distribution issue. Inequality. One source, citing the World Inequality Lab from 2024, points out income inequality in India has actually climbed quite a bit,
How much?
at the point where it's higher than the U.S., Brazil, South Africa.
Really? Higher than South Africa?
Yeah. And some metrics even suggest there was more income equity during British colonial rule, which is pretty stark.
That is stark. High inequality can cause social friction, obviously, but it also limits how much growth actually improves most people's lives. Makes you question the inclusiveness of the growth model.
Definitely. Now, okay, let's not just focus on India's challenges. China's facing its own headwinds, right?
True. They've got their own economic slowdown post-pandemic.
Their growth last quarter was, what, 4.7%?
Right.
Below their own 5% target for early 2025, so they're not immune either.
No, absolutely not. China's era of, like, supercharged growth is probably over. They're dealing with structural issues, too. But the sheer scale of their economy, their established manufacturing base, that still gives them a massive advantage.
Right. Which brings us to an expert opinion mentioned in one article, Alicia Garcia Herrero.
Ah, yes. What did she say?
She suggests India needs to maintain around 6% annual growth, consistently, just to catch up to China's size by 2050.
And that's assuming China's growth keeps slowing down.
Exactly. And she questions if that's even realistic, especially with India's recent slowdown.
It's a tall order.
Although, there's also a forecast mentioned that expects India to grow faster than China for many years to come. So, bit of a mixed message there.
It is mixed. Faster percentage growth potential for India.
Yes.
But the absolute gap in economic size right now is just enormous.
Yeah. Closing that gap needs consistently high growth over decades. A huge challenge. Okay, so we've looked at the numbers. Let's dig into the policy side, the history that shaped India's path.
Yeah, the context is crucial.
One source lays out 3 distinct phases. First, the Nehruvian era. Focus on making things at home, import substitution, leaning towards capital-intensive industries.
Right. Then in Indira Gandhi's time, lots of state control, regulation.
And then finally, the big shift.
Huh?
The liberalization era, post-1991. Lower tariffs, less licensing.
Understanding those phases is key. That initial focus on import substitution while aiming for self-reliance. It kind of unintentionally favored industries needing big investments over those needing lots of labor.
And India has a lot of labor.
Exactly.
Now, the 91 liberalization, even though one source called it half-hearted, it did have a positive effect, didn't it?
Oh, definitely. GDP growth doubled, roughly. Poverty levels dropped about 10 percentage points.
And India got more plugged into global trade.
Yeah. Total trade as a share of GDP jumped massively from like 13% in 1990 to 42% in 2012.
Okay, so reforms did unlock potential. But the impact of those earlier policies, that capital-intensive focus, it still lingered.
Absolutely. It continued to shape the manufacturing sector's structure.
And there's that criticism of the early import substitution policies, specifically for favoring capital over labor, pushing these capital-heavy industries.
It seems like that initial direction just had really long-lasting effects. It led to a manufacturing sector that, even after liberalization, kind of struggled to absorb the huge workforce available.
Unlike China's model, which was much more about soaking up labor.
Precisely.
Which brings us to India's labor laws. They often come up, don't they, as a possible reason for the missing middle.
The lack of mid-sized firms, yeah.
The source mentions evidence suggesting states with more pro-worker laws saw less manufacturing output, fewer jobs, less investment back between 1958 and 1992.
But it also cautions against a simple cause and effect conclusion, right?
Yeah, it points out complexities, like Gujarat and Maharashtra considered pro-worker states, yet they're manufacturing leaders. So it's not straightforward.
That nuance is really important. Strict labor laws can discourage firms from growing and hiring, sure. They're not the only factor. Managerial skills, access to finance, those play huge roles too.
Okay, so India's economic transformation, it's been unique in some ways.
How so?
Well, unlike the typical path for developing countries, India saw a really high share of its GDP coming from services early on, 56% back in 2012. More than manufacturing and agriculture.
Ah, the leapfrogging phenomenon. Bypassing large-scale manufacturing, maybe? The sources call it a departure from the usual Kuznets phenomenon.
Yeah. Why did that happen? Why services?
Well, several things. India has a long history of trade, finance, and also the education system, maybe historically linked to the caste system, had a bias towards certain groups associated with, literate professions.
And that historical context might have fed into strengths in areas like software today.
Potentially, yeah. It's an interesting thought. So the key takeaway is India's path was just different. Services came to the fore earlier than many other places.
That is an interesting connection. History shaping the modern software scene. Not immediately obvious. The sources also touch on agriculture. Land reforms didn't help poor farmers much, apparently. But the Green Revolution boosted yields, made India self-sufficient in food grains.
But that didn't necessarily mean the poor were eating more.
Right. And interesting, there was strong agricultural growth after 2003, driven by private investment. But again, not a huge impact on jobs or inequality.
So India's agricultural sector, while more productive, didn't really act as that same engine pushing people into manufacturing jobs like it did in, say, China. A lot of people still in rural areas.
Which leads to this idea of the rural non-farm sector in India.
Ah, yes, a potential engine for growth.
The sources point to it. It grew a lot between the late 70s and late 90s, offered better pay than farming. They're often casual work.
It sounds a bit like China's town and village enterprises, the TVEs. They were crucial for their growth.
Exactly. So what can India learn from China's TVE experience?
Well, China's model was heavily export-focused, labor-intensive manufacturing, and the TVEs were absolutely key, employing people in rural areas, driving industrialization.
Weren't they owned by local governments but run with market incentives?
Yeah, that encouraged entrepreneurship, job creation right there in the countryside.
And China also used those special economic zones, SEZs, really strategically, didn't they?
To attract foreign direct investment, FDI, especially from the Chinese diaspora.
Right. They specifically targeted their diaspora,
Huh.
and those investments were initially smaller scale, low to medium tech.
Yeah, and crucially, they linked up with the TVEs. That combination really boosted China's competitiveness internationally, especially in those labor-intensive sectors.
That diaspora connection seems like a real advantage, not just money, but networks, market knowledge.
Huge advantage. Made it easier to break into the global economy.
And China didn't just stay in low-skill stuff. They moved up the value chain, right?
Definitely. Shifted towards higher skill, tech-intensive exports. By 2013, that was almost 40% of their total exports. Low-skill stuff dropped below 10%.
The sources call it a flying geese formation. China leading, moving up, creating space.
And India, it seems, wasn't really part of that initial formation.
No. India's exports were still heavily based on raw materials, precious stones. Labor-intensive exports were a much smaller share.
Shows a fundamental difference in what their manufacturing sector specialized in and where they were competitive.
Okay, let's talk efficiency. Total factor productivity, TFP. How did they compare?
Between 2003 and 2007, the data suggests China generally showed improvements, positive TFP growth in most manufacturing sectors.
While India.
Mostly saw a decline, except in a few specific areas, beverages, some electronics, computers.
But interestingly, India actually performed better than China on TFP in high-tech industries during that time.
That's right. So India had pockets of strength, especially in more skilled sectors, but overall manufacturing productivity didn't keep pace with China's broader improvements back then.
China just had more widespread efficiency gains, better tech adoption across the board.
Seems like it.
And one last point on lessons from China. The sources mention their historically weak labor laws. Low-cost manufacturing, yes, but
At the cost of worker exploitation, low pay, long hours, little protection. It wasn't all positive.
no. A stark contrast to India's more protective laws, though, as we said, those come with their own debates about hindering growth.
It's a trade-off, always complex.
Okay, so considering all this,
Yeah.
what are India's strengths? What strategies could work? Demographics is a big one, right?
Huge potential asset, that large, growing young population, expected to be the world's largest around 2025, growing till 2050, while China's declines from 2026.
But the key is if they're educated and trained.
Absolutely. Realizing that demographic dividend depends entirely on investing in education, skills, and, crucially, creating enough quality jobs.
And the sources pointed out that worrying rise in unemployment among educated youth.
Yeah, the share of educated unemployed jumped from about 54% in 2000 to nearly 66% in 2022. That's a major challenge to capitalizing on the demographics.
A major hurdle. Okay, another potential strength mentioned, India's managerial talent. The sources suggest they're more focused on markets and finance. Market managers, they call them, rather than man managers.
Meaning good at spotting opportunities, raising funds, acquiring tech.
Exactly. But perhaps less skilled at organizing labor and managing the engineering side on a massive scale.
That's an interesting distinction, that market focus is good in a globalized world for attracting investment, but maybe a barrier to just copying China's large-scale, labor-intensive model.
Could be. However, there's some good news too. Technical efficiency has increased in India's skill-intensive industries, electronics, engineering.
Potentially linked to R&D investment.
Yeah.
And that managerial skill in seizing opportunities.
Seems likely. And this leads to a potential strategy, leveraging the rural non-farm sector, India's version of TVEs.
How would that work?
The idea is urban firms moving to rural areas, government helps with infrastructure, focus on differentiated products, textiles, leather, wood for export.
And using India's software skills.
Yes, for communication, finance, design, advertising. Imagine a collaboration. Rural non-farm businesses, software experts, and larger established firms.
Exploiting India's advantages in services, skilled managers, and that semi-skilled rural labor pool.
Yeah, it connects to that idea from A.M. Khusro, bringing infrastructure to where people are in rural areas to create jobs and income right there.
That strategy of spreading industrialization, using India's unique strengths, it could be a distinct path, acknowledging that just copying China might not work.
But let's be real, the challenges to superpower status are significant.
Maintaining high growth rates tough, as we've seen.
Ensuring the benefits reach everyone, tackling that inequality and poverty, still huge obstacles.
Need for better tech, infrastructure, building robust institutions not swayed by politics.
The jobs crisis for educated youth. The fact that real wages haven't significantly risen since 2014. Major concerns.
And the geopolitics, especially with China. Security concerns often trump economic ones there. Border tensions.
Absolutely. Plus, India's export mix is still heavily reliant on primary commodities, precious stones, gold like 47% in 2013. Labor-intensive exports only 8%.
Capital-intensive industries still dominating output.
And the retail sector, still largely closed to FDI. Overall, FDI inflows are way lower than China's.
That's a key difference in getting the capital needed for growth. And India's overall investment level relative to GDP is just lower than China's historically high rates, underlying structural issues.
Yeah. Becoming a true superpower needs more than just economic muscle. It needs an inclusive society, tech capability, stable international relations.
It's a complex web.
Okay, so let's try and sum up this deep dive. The sources really suggest that Tony Blair's 2050 prediction, well, it's ambitious.
Very ambitious. The economic and structural realities we've looked at present pretty big challenges.
Compared to China's path, India faces hurdles. Maintaining high growth, tackling inequality, actually leveraging that young population.
Definitely. Though India does have strength services, that rural non-farm potential. But the path to 2050 superpower status, it's far from guaranteed.
So going back to Blair's bold claim, it really hinges on massive, sustained reforms and growth, overcoming these headwinds and historical patterns we've talked about.
Absolutely. It requires overcoming a lot of inertia and tackling deep-seated issues.
Right. So here's a final thought for you listening. Given all these complexities, the numbers, the policies, the history, the challenges, what single factor do you think will be most critical in shaping India's economic future? Its potential to really rival the established superpowers.
And maybe what overlooked aspects, something we didn't get into detail on from these sources, might actually hold the key to unlocking India's manufacturing potential. Something to think about.